What happens when the most common Allied tank, often mocked as a battlefield pushover, suddenly gains a weapon powerful enough to pierce German armor from a mile away? What happens when German tank crews, so used to dominating in North Africa, find themselves hunted by a machine they believed could never exist? On one day in the desert, Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox himself, would learn that the Sherman Firefly was no ordinary tank. It was a predator waiting to strike, and its arrival signaled the end of German confidence in armored supremacy. The Sherman had long been the workhorse of the Allied armies. It was built in staggering numbers, reliable, easy to repair, and capable of operating in almost any environment. But it carried one fatal weakness. Its 75mm gun was not strong enough to defeat the heavy armor of the German Panzer IV with its long barrel. And it stood no chance against the Tiger, whose thick plates shrugged off Allied shells like stones against steel. Crews inside Shermans often faced a grim reality. They could hit the enemy over and over again, only to watch their rounds bounce harmlessly away. Meanwhile, German guns tore through their armor at long range, leaving burning hulks scattered across the battlefield. By late 1942 and early 1943, this imbalance was becoming unbearable. Rommel's forces seemed unstoppable. His panzers had driven deep into the deserts of North Africa, outmaneuvering British and American formations, and sending Allied commanders scrambling for solutions. The Shermans rolled forward in numbers, but numbers alone were not enough. For every tank the Allies produced, the Germans produced fear in equal measure. Allied soldiers began to speak of Tigers as invincible beasts, roaming the desert with impunity. Morale was sinking fast, and the risk of defeat was all too real. The stakes were higher than many at the time realized. Control of North Africa meant control of the Suez Canal, the gateway to the Middle East, and its vital oil resources. If Rommel and the Afrika Korps secured that prize, the strategic map of the war could tilt heavily in Germany's favor. Britain, already stretched thin, could be cut off from supplies and reinforcements. American support, still building after entry into the war, might not be enough to hold the line. In the desert sands, the future of the Mediterranean campaign was at risk, and with it, the entire balance of the Second World War. It was in this climate of desperation that Allied minds began to turn towards something new. They needed more than just another tank. They needed a weapon that could strip away German confidence and strike fear into the very crews who had dominated them for so long. They needed to take the Sherman, a tank the Germans laughed at, and transform it into something the Axis could never ignore. Out of this need would come the Sherman Firefly, a machine that seemed ordinary at first glance, but whose long gun told a different story. When Rommel's panzers finally faced it, they would discover that the old rules of armored warfare no longer applied. The hunted had become the hunter, and the desert war would never be the same. By the time the war in North Africa reached its most critical stage, Rommel was already a legend. The German people called him the Desert Fox, and even his enemies respected his skill. He had gained his reputation in France during the Blitzkrieg of 1940, and he carried that same energy into the deserts of Libya and Egypt. His forces moved with speed and precision. They struck where they were least expected, and then faded into the desert before the Allies could respond. British and American troops came to dread his maneuvers. Commanders knew that if Rommel was in the field, their lines would be tested to the breaking point. Central to his success was the armored fist of the Afrika Korps. German tanks were not invincible, but compared to what the Allies could field at the time, they might as well have been. The Panzer IV, upgraded with a long-barreled 75mm gun, could destroy Allied tanks at distances where return fire was useless. The arrival of the Tiger made matters even worse. Its armor was thick enough to shrug off most shells, and its powerful 88mm gun could tear through Allied armor at long range. The very sight of a Tiger on the horizon could send shivers through an Allied formation. Men spoke of them in hushed tones, as if they were mythical beasts roaming the desert. The Sherman, which made up the bulk of Allied armor, was reliable but badly outgunned. Crews liked it for its mechanical dependability. It started easily in the morning, ran smoothly in desert heat, and could be repaired quickly when damaged. But when those same crews went into combat against German armor, they knew they were at a disadvantage. Their gun could not penetrate the front of a Tiger at any reasonable range. Even against the Panzer IV, The Sherman often needed to close dangerously close to have a chance. Many crews died trying, their tanks burning under the hot desert sun. For the men inside, it often felt like a death sentence to be sent against Rommel's armor. Allied High Command understood the danger. If they could not blunt Rommel's advances, North Africa might be lost. And if North Africa fell, the Mediterranean would be at risk, along with vital shipping lanes through the Suez Canal. Control of the Middle East and its oil might then fall into German hands. The consequences of such a loss were grave. Britain's war effort could collapse under the strain. American reinforcements might arrive too late to change the outcome. This was not just a battle for desert sand. It was a fight for the future balance of the entire war. Efforts to counter Rommel's tanks were constant, but progress was slow. Allied crews tried new tactics. They sought to use numbers and coordination to overwhelm German formations. They relied heavily on air support, hoping that bombers and fighters could soften German armor before it reached their lines. At times these efforts succeeded, but too often they failed. German tanks remained the backbone of Rommel's battlefield success. Even when he was short of fuel or supplies, the presence of his Panzers kept the Allies cautious, hesitant to strike too boldly. The psychological advantage of German armor was as important as its physical superiority. For the men on the ground, each encounter reinforced the same lesson. Germans could not stand toe-to-toe with German tanks. The only hope was to find another way. Some commanders dreamed of fielding heavier Allied tanks, but such machines were still far from production. Others argued for more anti-tank guns, dug in and hidden, waiting for German armor to come into range. These weapons had their moments, but they were static. They could not maneuver with the flexibility that Rommel's fast-moving forces demanded. Something different was required, a weapon that could match German armor in both mobility and firepower. A tank that could not only survive, but also strike fear into the crews of Tigers and Panzers. The urgency of the problem created a sense of desperation across Allied lines. Soldiers in the field whispered that nothing could stop the German advance. Commanders debated solutions endlessly, but few seemed realistic. The balance of power tilted heavily toward Rommel, and every day that passed brought the possibility of collapse closer. Yet in this atmosphere of frustration and looming defeat, there were men who refused to accept the situation as hopeless. They began to think differently. They looked at what was available, what could be changed, and how far they could push the limits of existing machines. The Sherman, dismissed as too weak for the job, was about to be reimagined. From the desperation of the Desert War, the idea of the Sherman Firefly was beginning to take root. The need for a new weapon was clear. German tanks ruled the battlefield, and every Allied attempt to meet them head-on ended in loss. The answer was sitting in British arsenals, but it was not yet in a form that could be used with speed and mobility. The 17-pounder anti-tank gun was one of the most powerful weapons available. It had been designed to punch through even the thickest German armor. In field tests, it could pierce the Tiger from long range. The problem was that the gun was massive. It was designed for towed mounts and fixed positions. It was not something that could be easily fitted into the turret of a medium tank, like the Sherman. Most experts thought the idea was impossible. British engineers were not so quick to give up. They knew that the Sherman had the numbers. Thousands of them were arriving from American factories. If even a fraction could be equipped with the 17-pounder, the balance of power might be restored. The challenge was to take this enormous gun, with its heavy recoil and long barrel, and somehow mount it on a tank never built to carry it. Official channels dismissed the idea. The turret was too small. The recoil would tear the mounting apart. The loader would have no space to work. To many, the problem seemed unsolvable. Yet in workshops and testing grounds, engineers began to experiment. They cut into turrets, shifting components around, redesigning recoil systems. They mounted the gun at an angle to make room for the breech. They stripped out equipment and storage space. Everything unnecessary was removed until the weapon could just barely fit. It was a patchwork of adjustments, a solution that came not from grand design but from improvisation under pressure. Each modification carried risks. The loader had less space. Ammunition was harder to handle. The balance of the turret was altered. But for those who worked on it, the risks were worth taking. Without this weapon, Allied crews would continue to die in tanks that could not match their enemy. Behind this effort were men who refused to accept defeat. Many were ordinary engineers, mechanics and officers who understood the battlefield problem better than those in distant offices. They saw the fear in the eyes of Sherman crews. They heard the stories of tanks destroyed before they could even fire a shot. They wanted to give those crews a fighting chance. The 17-pounder was that chance. It was a weapon powerful enough to change the fight, if only it could be brought to the battlefield in a mobile form. The process was not smooth. Each attempt revealed new difficulties. Sometimes the recoil mechanism jammed. Sometimes the turret balance was wrong, making the gun difficult to aim. Ammunition storage was another problem. The shells for the 17-pounder were larger and heavier than those of the standard Sherman gun. Engineers had to find space where there was none, moving supplies and redesigning racks. Step by step, the problems were addressed. None of the solutions were perfect, but together they created something that worked. Slowly, the impossible began to look possible. By the time the first working models appeared, doubts remained. The modifications were rough. The gun filled almost every inch of space in the turret. The crew had to work in cramped and uncomfortable conditions. Some officers questioned if the tank could fight effectively under these circumstances, but then the weapon was tested in firing trials. The results were undeniable. The 17-pounder rounds cut through armor that had once seemed invincible. Even the thick plates of the Tiger could not stand against it. For the first time, Allied commanders saw a weapon that could restore balance against German armor. The Sherman Firefly was not yet official, but it was born in those improvised workshops. What began as a desperate experiment was now a real machine. It carried the flaws of its rushed design, but it also carried hope. Crews who had once gone into battle feeling like prey could now imagine being the hunters. The innovators had achieved what many thought impossible. They had given the Sherman teeth sharp enough to bite through German steel. And in doing so, they had changed the course of the Desert War before a single Firefly had even faced the enemy. The first Shermans fitted with the 17-pounder looked awkward. The long barrel stretched far beyond the nose of the tank, giving it an unbalanced appearance. The turret seemed overstuffed, as if it was straining to hold a weapon far too large for it. Yet appearances did not matter. What mattered was that at last, the Allies had a tank gun that could destroy the enemy's most feared machines. The Sherman Firefly was a strange hybrid, part improvisation and part engineering marvel. It was not elegant, but it was deadly. Testing showed quickly that the Firefly was unlike anything the Germans expected to face. Standard Shermans fired their 75mm guns with little effect against heavy armor. Fireflies, by contrast, could pierce the front of a Tiger at over a mile. Crews who fired it for the first time could hardly believe the power. At last they had the means to strike back. The tank that had been mocked as weak had suddenly become the most dangerous weapon on the battlefield. But there were problems that could not be ignored. Inside the cramped turret, the crew worked in tight quarters. The loader struggled with large shells. Storage was limited and awkward. The recoil of the gun shook the tank violently. The modifications had left the Firefly difficult to handle in some ways. Still, the crews who trained with it were willing to accept the discomfort. They knew what it meant to face German armor without a chance to win. Now they finally had a weapon that gave them hope. They could live with the flaws, because the strength of the gun outweighed everything else. The tactical role of the Firefly was also unique. Commanders understood that the Germans would soon learn to fear and target it. If a Firefly was spotted in a formation, it would be the first tank the enemy tried to destroy. The solution was to mix Fireflies with ordinary Shermans. In a column of tanks, only 1 in 4 might be a Firefly. To the enemy, they all looked similar at a distance. This disguise allowed the Firefly to hide in plain sight until it was ready to strike. The Germans would often open fire, thinking they faced standard Shermans, only to find themselves under attack from a gun that could reach them long before they were in range to reply. Crews quickly grew proud of the Firefly. They decorated them with names, painted slogans on the barrels, and carried themselves with renewed confidence. The tank became more than just another machine. It was a symbol of resilience and ingenuity. It proved that even when the enemy seemed untouchable, there was always a way to fight back. The transformation of the Sherman from underdog to predator lifted morale across the ranks. Stories spread quickly of what the new gun could do, and soldiers began to believe that German armor was no longer invincible. As word of the Firefly's effectiveness spread, German commanders took notice. Reports reached Rommel's staff, warning that British Shermans with unusually long barrels were destroying heavy tanks at shocking ranges. Orders were soon issued to prioritize these strange Shermans. If spotted, they had to be eliminated first, no matter the cost. This fear was proof of the Firefly's success. The Germans had gone from laughing at the Sherman to hunting one specific version with desperation. By the time Fireflies began appearing in numbers, the Desert War was entering its decisive phase. The Allies were preparing for major offensives, and armored clashes would decide the outcome. The Firefly was not a perfect tank, but it was a tool the Allies had needed for far too long. Its gun was enough to change the psychology of the battlefield. German crews no longer fought with certainty of superiority. Now they had to face the chance that the next Sherman they saw might not be harmless at all. It might be the Firefly waiting quietly to strike from a distance they thought safe. That fear alone was a weapon as powerful as the gun itself. The desert sun was unforgiving when Rommel's forces prepared for another advance. His Panzers stood ready, engines rumbling, crews confident after so many victories. For months the German tanks had dominated. Their armor shrugged off enemy fire. Their guns destroyed Shermans long before Allied tanks could respond. Rommel believed the pattern would continue. His officers had seen nothing to suggest otherwise. The battlefield, however, was about to present them with something new. Hidden among the ranks of ordinary Shermans were machines unlike any they had faced before. These were the Fireflies, and their presence would turn a routine clash into a shock that echoed across the desert campaign. The battle began with familiar rhythms. German tanks advanced in formation, dust rising behind them as they rolled toward Allied positions. Crews settled into routines they knew well. Spot the enemy, line up targets, open fire at long range, and watch Shermans burst into flames. Confidence was high. To the German tankers, the Shermans opposite them looked no different than before. Short-barreled, underpowered, and already doomed, but appearances deceived. Inside a few of those Shermans were guns far longer, shells far heavier, and crews waiting for the right moment. At over a mile away, a Firefly commander gave the order. The loader heaved a massive shell into the breach. The gunner took aim, heart racing as he realized the target was a Tiger. He steadied his sight, squeezed the trigger, and the tank shook as the 17-pounder roared. The shell streaked across the desert and slammed into the Tiger's frontal armor. For a moment, nothing happened. Then smoke and flame erupted. The German crew scrambled in panic as the machine that had once seemed unstoppable burned from a single shot. The Firefly had proven itself in the harshest test possible. Shock rippled through the German lines. They had believed themselves safe at such ranges. The Tiger was supposed to be invincible from the front. Yet here it was destroyed, its wreckage a blackened reminder that something had changed. German tankers scanned the horizon in confusion. They saw Shermans, as always, but they could not tell which held this new weapon. Fear began to replace confidence. If even a Tiger could be struck down, none of them was safe. The battle grew chaotic. More Fireflies joined the fight, each hidden among columns of standard Shermans. Another Panzer was hit and left burning. Then another. German gunners fired back furiously, but often they aimed at the wrong targets. Standard Shermans were destroyed in the exchange, but for every Allied tank lost, a German one now paid the price. The balance that had long favored Rommel was slipping away before his eyes. His crews had relied on their range advantage. That advantage was gone. They had relied on their armor. That too was failing. The Firefly had stripped them of both strengths. Rommel himself, observing from a command vehicle, grasped the implications quickly. He had built his reputation on maneuver and the bold use of armored forces. Those forces had always counted on superiority in tank combat. Now he faced an enemy that had found a way to level the field. Worse, the Firefly tilted it in their favor. The desert fox, so often the hunter, saw his Panzers turned into prey. He ordered counterattacks, but even his skill could not mask the new reality. Every German push risked being cut apart by unseen Fireflies. Each mile of advance carried the possibility of sudden destruction from a range once thought secure. For the Allied crews, the mood was transformed. Where once they had gone into battle with dread, they now felt pride. Firefly gunners spoke of the thrill of seeing German tanks explode at distances where they had never before had hope. Loaders worked frantically in cramped turrets, sweat pouring as they forced shell after shell into the breach. Commanders urged their men on, knowing that the battle was no longer a one-sided slaughter. The Firefly gave them the power to fight on equal terms, and in moments even superior terms. The fighting stretched on through the day, but the psychological effect was immediate. German crews no longer advanced with the same boldness. They maneuvered cautiously, scanning the horizon for the long barrel of the Firefly. But spotting one was difficult. Every Sherman looked similar until it fired, and by then it was too late. German units that had once rolled forward with confidence now hesitated, their momentum broken. Rommel's plans faltered as his armor stalled under the weight of fear and uncertainty. When the dust settled, the field told the story. German wrecks smoldered where they had once triumphed. Allied tanks, many destroyed as well, held their ground with new determination. Among the survivors, stories spread quickly of how the Firefly had killed Tigers and Panzers alike. Word would travel through the ranks, and soon across the entire theater. The myth of German invincibility was broken. The Sherman, mocked as weak, had delivered a stunning blow. For Rommel, the day marked a grim realization. His armor was no longer supreme. A weapon born from British improvisation had turned the tide. The Firefly had shown that Allied innovation could meet German engineering and prevail. He understood that from now on, every battle carried new risk. His Panzers could burn from distances they had once ruled with impunity. The balance of the Desert War had shifted, and the Firefly stood at the center of that change. The clash had lasted hours, but its legacy would last far longer. In one battle, the Firefly had announced itself with fire and smoke. It had shown Rommel and his men that the days of unchecked German dominance were ending. And it had given the Allies the confidence that victory was possible, not just in numbers, but in the power of a single tank transformed by ingenuity. The smoke of battle lingered over the desert as the sun began to sink. Allied crews climbed from their tanks, covered in dust, sweat, and the acrid stench of cordite. Around them lay the wrecks of German armor, some still burning, others silent steel tombs for the men who had once believed themselves untouchable. For the Allies, the sight was more than a tactical success. It was proof that the tide could turn, that the fear which had gripped them for so long could be broken. The Sherman Firefly had not only fought, it had shattered the aura of invincibility surrounding Rommel's Panzers. The immediate consequence was psychological. German tankers who once advanced with calm confidence now entered each battle with unease. They could no longer rely on armor to protect them. They could no longer trust that long range would guarantee survival. The Firefly had extended the reach of the Allies to match and even surpass their own. Each new clash carried the possibility that an unseen Firefly lurked among ordinary Shermans waiting to fire. This uncertainty weighed heavily on the Afrika Korps. Morale began to slip, and with it, the sharp edge of German armored tactics dulled. For the Allied crews, the Firefly inspired pride and a sense of purpose. They gave their tanks names and spoke of them as living things. Some painted slogans or symbols on the long barrel, boasting of kills or reminding themselves of what they fought for. There was hardship inside those cramped turrets, but there was also confidence. They no longer went into battle expecting death. They went in knowing they could kill the enemy's best machines. That shift in mindset was as important as the armor and gun itself. Men who believe they can win fight differently. They hold their ground longer. They strike more boldly. They refuse to break under pressure. The Firefly gave that belief back to the Allies. As news of the Firefly spread, German intelligence began issuing warnings. Reports described Shermans with unusually long guns, able to pierce even the Tiger at a mile. Orders circulated to German tank crews: destroy these vehicles first. Do not allow them to fire. Some German units even changed their tactics, holding back at longer ranges than before, or sending reconnaissance patrols to spot Fireflies before committing heavy armor. These adjustments revealed the depth of German concern. They no longer dictated the terms of battle. They reacted to the presence of a weapon that had been built in secrecy and delivered to the front through sheer determination. Strategically, the Firefly played a key role in restoring balance. The Allied armies knew that numbers alone would not win the Desert War. They needed a weapon that could counter German armor head-on. With the Firefly, they gained that tool. It did not replace every Sherman, nor could it. There were never enough Fireflies to match German tanks 1-for-1. But their presence among Allied units acted as a force multiplier. A single Firefly could hold back enemy advances that would otherwise crush entire formations. Its long-range strikes made German commanders hesitate, and hesitation on the battlefield often spelled defeat. In this way, even a handful of Fireflies could alter the outcome of major battles. Rommel himself could see the shift. He had always prided himself on adapting to new circumstances, but the Firefly struck at the heart of his armored doctrine. He thrived on speed, surprise, and overwhelming armored force. Those tactics relied on German tanks being superior. When that superiority was challenged, his freedom of action narrowed. The Desert Fox found himself more cautious, less able to rely on the devastating armored thrusts that had carried him to fame. For the first time, he faced an enemy whose machines could fight his Panzers on equal terms. That realization was sobering, and it forced him to rethink strategies that had once seemed unstoppable. Beyond the immediate desert campaign, the Firefly's legacy spread across the wider war. By the time of the Normandy invasion, Fireflies were a crucial part of British and Commonwealth armored units. On the fields of France, they faced Panthers and Tigers, and once again proved their worth. German tankers came to fear the silhouette of a Sherman, with a barrel stretching far ahead of its hull. They knew that behind that barrel lay the power to pierce even their heaviest armor. The Firefly became a symbol of Allied ingenuity, a reminder that even a tank considered mediocre could be transformed into a predator with the right weapon. There were criticisms, of course. Some officers pointed out the cramped turret and the strain it placed on the crew. Others noted that the long barrel made the Firefly conspicuous and difficult to maneuver in tight terrain. Yet these flaws did not erase its impact. The Firefly was not meant to be perfect. It was meant to be effective, and on that measure it succeeded beyond expectation. In war, perfection often matters less than timely innovation. The Firefly arrived when it was needed most, and that timing gave it a significance far greater than its numbers alone. The moral of the Firefly's story was clear. Innovation born of desperation can alter the course of history. The tank was not the result of careful long-term planning. It was the product of engineers and soldiers who refused to accept defeat, who bent rules and pushed machines beyond their design limits. They worked with what they had and created something the enemy had not anticipated. In doing so, they reminded the world that victory often belongs not to the side with the strongest doctrine, but to the side willing to take risks and embrace change. For the men who served in Fireflies, the tank was more than steel and firepower. It was a chance at survival. It was the answer to the dread that had haunted them each time they faced German armor. When they loaded the 17-pounder shell and watched it slam into a Tiger, they felt not only relief, but also vindication. Their sacrifices were not in vain. They could stand their ground and fight back. In that sense, the Firefly gave them more than victory. It gave them dignity on the battlefield. The day Rommel faced the Firefly marked a turning point. It was not the end of the war, nor the final defeat of German armor. But it was a moment when the illusion of German dominance cracked. From that day on, the desert was no longer a place where Panzers roamed without fear. It was a place where Allied tanks could strike back, where ingenuity could overcome engineering, and where the balance of power could shift in a single battle. Rommel saw it with his own eyes. He realized that the rules had changed, and that his enemy had found a way to burn his Panzers alive from a mile away. The Firefly's legacy endures as a symbol of transformation. A common tank, mocked and underestimated, became the bane of Germany's most feared machines. It showed that victory often depends not on what you start with, but on what you make of it. The Allies took what they had, reimagined it, and turned it into a weapon that reshaped the battlefield. In doing so, they not only changed the course of the Desert War, they also offered a timeless lesson. In the face of overwhelming odds, innovation and courage can break even the strongest enemy.